Welcome back to part 2 of our double episode about Socialist Fairy and Folk Tales with Michael Rosen. If you haven't listened to part 1 yet, I recommend you go back and listen to that first.
Alla mattina, appena alzata, oh bella ciao, bella ciao, bella ciao, ciao, ciao alla mattina.
Before we get into the episode, this is just a quick reminder that we're only able to produce this podcast thanks to the support of our listeners on Patreon. Our supporters fund our work and, in return, get exclusive early access to podcast episodes, bonus episodes, free and discounted merch and other content. Join us or find out more at patreon.com/workingclasshistory. Link in the show notes. Children's stories are frequently shot through with all kinds of social and political assumptions, which are included, intentionally or not, by their adult authors. Everything from who the good guys are, who or what threatens them, what constitutes a tragedy or a happy ending, are all based on ideas of what's good and proper in society.
Some stories that were given to children were what we call very reactionary in ideas. That's to say that the status quo is perfect, that all sorts of people outside of your circle are threatening and dangerous, and you're entitled to the privilege that you have. And a lot of stories of this period, they suggest that. So famously, think of Wind in the Willows. So again, Wind in the Willows, jolly little animal story. We don't need to think about class, or do we? So Toad where does he live? Oh, he lives in Toad Hall. Well, what is Toad Hall? It's a sort of aristocratic sort of place. He's a bit of a wayward son of the aristocracy, isn't he, Toad? And then Badger is more of a sort of middle class. He's very sort of stolid, and he doesn't live in a castle or a mansion, but he's very stolid and very supportive of Toad. He's trying to get Toad to be less wayward. And then meanwhile, we have the Oiks. We have the Ferrets and the Stoats out there. And then we have Mole, who's more like a sort of a little slightly timid bohemian. So here we've got a little sort of map of a few layers in almost, we could say, in English society. They're very English figures in the way they speak. And then horror of horrors, of course, if we've got, keeping with my model, possibly the Ferrets and the Stoats are kind of workers and working class people, wild and dangerous, and little Mole is so scared of them. And so he allies himself, this little timid bohemian, not with the Ferrets and Stoats, who he lives with, but more with Badger and Toad, even though Toad's a bit of a scary dead loss as an aristocrat. But luckily there's Badger, who can, as it were, pull Toad into line to get on with ruling over the world in a better way. So here you've got a classic case of a sort of status quo story. It's a status quo is disrupted by the Ferrets and Stoats, who are kind of en masse and unnamed and do horrible things like mocking the ruling class, calling out from the depths of the wood. And then the status quo is resumed when they're driven out. The frightful, terrible, disgusting image of the Ferrets and Stoats living it up, the absolute life of Riley in Toad's house, when they've effectively conducted a revolution. So all this is a very alien way of talking about children's books, but actually, if you can see, remember, bear in mind that it's an adult who's written this, who must have been aware of all this stuff in writing it. So there you've got an example of a sort of a status quo-y type story. But then if you take the Alice books, it's quite odd. I mean, they're written by somebody who's sort of sitting in the most classic ivory tower of all, Christ Church College in Oxford. In fact, it's so ivory tower, you're not even supposed to call it a college, you're supposed to call it Christ Church. That's how kind of posh it is. So there he is, he's sitting there, some kind of odd religious role that he had in the college, and he produces the Alice books. And when you read the Alice books, what they are is quite extraordinary, because here you've got this young girl, not quite clear who she belongs to or where she's from, so she's a bit disembodied. But once she's in Wonderland, she challenges every form that she meets. Now, whether it's something that's kind of non-identifiable in class terms, like a Cheshire cat, or it's much more identifiable, sort of pompous old farts and people trying to kind of push her about a bit, she challenges them all. So in terms of a sort of I would say feminist, but certainly in terms of upsetting the social order, she defies it all. The status quo is not accepted. When she's in Wonderland, she won't accept what she's told. Quite a lot of it is about word games and language games, but that doesn't matter. It's still, you remember how in life we're very much contained with, or at least particularly at that time, in the language that is given to children in schools. Carol was forever parodying this. So, instead of writing and reading, he calls it reeling and writhing. So, you may think that's very mild, but it develops through the stories of constant subverting of the status quo, whether in terms of language or logic. There's Humpty Dumpty making up what he calls portmanteau words. 'Twas Brillig and the slithy toves did gyre and gimble in the wabe, or mimsy were the borogoves and the mome raths outgrabe. And you might think, well, there's nothing revolutionary or subversive about that. Well, isn't there? Maybe there is, because after all, people were always telling Victorian kids to learn these kind of sort of famous classical poems, whether in Latin or Greek or English, about somebody going out and defeating a dragon or something. And Lewis Carroll, Charles Lutwidge Dodgson, he's turned that into a sort of mocking thing. And he does that again with a very kind of boring little poem that was given to kids at Sunday schools. There we are, the Sunday schools, about how doth the busy bee improve each shining hour. It was a way to teach children they must get on and work, and they mustn't indulge in fripperies or too much playtime. And then he mocked that with how doth the busy crocodile improve his shining tail. And so there's a lot of mockery of the established order in Lewis Carroll. So you could, if you put alongside, say, put the Alice book alongside Wind in the Willows, and you can see that the traditions going on, largely middle-class consumption, are actually very varied. They're not simply one uniform pattern.
With all that in mind, the various entries in Workers' Tales are very much part of a tradition that uses seemingly simple stories to put forward ideas about society and how it should be. In this case, more the tradition that subverts the social order than the one that supports it. Here, Michael reads the first story from his anthology, An Old Fable Retold by William Morris.
In the days before man had completely established his domination over the animal world, the poultry of a certain country, unnamed in my record, met in solemn conference in the largest hall they could hire for their money. The period was serious, for it was drawing near Christmas, and the question in the debate partook of the gravity of the times, for in short, various resolutions, the wording of which has not come down to us, were to be moved on the all-important subject, with what sauce shall we be eaten? Needless to say that the hall was crowded to suffocation, or that an overflow meeting presided over by working-class leaders was held on the neighbouring dunghill. All went smoothly. The meeting was apparently unanimous and certainly enthusiastic. Abundant wisdom was poured out on the all-important question, and the hearts of all glowed with satisfaction at the progress of the race of poultry. The very bantam hens were made happy by the assurance that their claims to cackling were seriously considered. But when the hands of the clock were pointing to 10 minutes to 10, the excited audience, as they recovered from the enthusiasm produced by one of the great speeches of the evening, saw on the platform beside the chairman a battered-looking and middle-aged barn-door cock, who they perceived was holding forth in a lugubrious voice, praising the career and motives of every advanced politician of the poultry yard. This bored the audience a great deal, but being used to it, they stood it with patience for some time, till at last the orator's voice got rather clearer and louder, and he spoke somewhat as follows. Sir, I know I have little right to air my own theories, cheers, after the remarkably and clear exposition of the rights of poultry, which has been delivered in various ways on this platform tonight, loud cheers. But I am free to confess that one idea has occurred to me which seems to have escaped the more educated minds of our leaders tonight. Cries of, oh, oh. The idea is this. Here he stopped dead, and amid ironical cheers tried nervously to help himself to water from the long-ago emptied decanter, then at last blurted out in a trembling, shrieking voice, not without a suspicion of tears in it, "In short, I don't want to be eaten at all. Is it possible?" But here a storm of disapproving cries broke out, amongst which could be heard the loudest the words "practical politics," "county franchise," "great Liberal Party," "municipal government for Coxstead," which at last all calmed themselves down into a steady howl of "question, question," in the midst of which the ragged, middle-aged cock withdrew, apparently not much more depressed than when he first stood up. After his departure, the meeting ended in all harmony, and a resolution was passed with great enthusiasm that the conclusions come to as embodied in the foregoing resolutions should be engrossed and forwarded to the farmer's wife, or widow was it, and the head poulterer. A rumour has reached us that while there were doubts as to the sauce to be used in the serving up, slow stewing was settled on as the least revolutionary form of cookery. Moral? Citizens, pray draw it for yourselves.
This story actually reminds me of a novel that was published sometime afterwards, Robert Tressel's socialist classic, The Ragged-Trousered Philanthropists. I'm thinking specifically of that chapter when working-class Liberal and Tory supporters are arguing at an election meeting. Socialists try to participate, but are told not to disturb the meeting and are threatened with violence. The difficulty of cutting through conventional wisdom was, and, if we're being honest, continues to be, a common experience. And we can read Morris, like Tressel after him, as holding that up for satire.
So the idea, obviously, of chickens and arguing with themselves as to which sauce would be the best means of delivering them up dead, is a wonderful parody of, we know the, you could argue it's almost like saying First World War soldiers arguing, should they have a rifle or a carbine, and marching off to war to be shot. I mean, we could say, count it millions of times over that we conspire in the means of our own downfall by being distracted by worrying about, whether I'm going to be wearing boots or shoes, So it's a very cunning little story, and I quite like the way he set it in the middle of a meeting in which people are solemnly discussing these things and passing resolutions.
In his introduction, Michael writes that the stories in his anthology represent socialism at its most hopeful, perhaps at its most innocent, something which might not be immediately obvious to readers today.
Yes, I guess what I meant by that is that amongst this group of stories, I mean, that, as it happens, it's almost contradicted by what I've just read to you, because they are without cynicism. That William Morris one is the most cynical of the stories, because it's saying the working class movement is constantly getting diverted into arguing about which is the best way to serve them up. And that's, if you like, the most cynical. Most of the stories are full of a form either of optimism that, if only you could just see how exploitation works, then with that realization, the thing would crumble. So there's a sort of innocence there, if you like. Or some of the stories are quite good at expressing, I wouldn't say terror exactly, but certainly kind of awful stuff. I'm thinking of one story, The Nightmare Bridge, by Glanville Maidstone from 1920. And it's quite interesting because a story like that, it doesn't have an end. It's just telling you there's this kind of awful and frightening and terrible place. And the question is asked by one of the people in the story, do we have to live with this? Do we have to endure it? He asked, where are we? But the crowd, I said, will the crowd endure this? There's so many. They could pull the railings down, and so on. So I find the writing, think of the period 1880 to 1920. It does cover the First World War, though there's not much about militarism in these stories. It's prior to the disaster of Nazism and Stalinism. So both these two terrible mid-20th century historical tragedies have cast different kinds of shadow, but both shadows over the left-wing movement. Nazism, because it was a disaster for the whole of Europe, and indeed, of course, more particularly for the German working class, and of course, people of my background, Jews. Unbelievable disaster. So that casts one light, but also more than that, that Nazism revealed a form of bestiality and savagery that people thought that science and the Enlightenment would avoid. But in actual fact, science and the Enlightenment was employed in order to bring about the bestiality. This was beastly stuff done by very, very well-educated, intelligent scientists, philosophers, historians, working out, the rights of the Superman, the super race, and the opposite for the Übermensch, for everybody else. And so that has kind of chilled the hearts of the left in a variety of ways. And then, of course, the disaster of Stalinism is that, for many in the left, certainly the period 1917 to maybe up until the Second World War, maybe not as long as that, there seemed to have been some wonderful thing had happened. Wasn't this a socialist revolution? Wasn't this huge place moving towards socialism? And then even as the stories were coming out that there were terrible camps and torturings and whatever going on, then in a sense it was sort of held in abeyance by the Second World War. And obviously the Soviet Union was crucial to the defeating of Nazism at immense sacrifice to the ordinary people of Russia and the Soviet republics. Terrible, terrible toll that it took, maybe as many as 20 million. So there's no innocence after these two events. There's no, you can't come out of these two moments of Nazism and Stalinism and somehow say, oh, well, things will work out all right in the end. It'll be okay. And even a sort of leftist form of optimism that if we could just be a bit more enlightened, if we could just, and, you can't get by without factoring in the way in which, leftist, progressive, socialist ideas can be assaulted from all directions, face to face with forms of militarism, tyranny, dictatorship, and so on. But these stories, I find a sort of innocence about them because, of course, they don't know about Nazism and Stalinism. If they had maybe lifted their eyes a bit more, they could have seen what was going on in the British Empire. But these stories seem, as I say, largely kind of innocent of these things. Of course, they would be because they haven't happened yet, but they're also actually innocent of the terrors of that, we know went on in the First World War and also the terrors of the British Empire.
One entry from the anthology which sums up this kind of pre-fascism, pre-Stalin innocence is the 1887 story Aristos and Demos by D.F. Hannigan. In the story, the tyrannical king Aristos is overthrown by his subjects, led by Demos, who calls for the organisation of labour as the best way to topple the regime. The struggle is quick and largely bloodless, and after storming the palace, the people find Aristos dead amid his luxury. Though the people want to take out their anger on Aristos' dead body, Demos calls on them not to, despite the wrongs he had made them suffer.
True, said Demos, we have destroyed the system. Is not that enough? If they submit to human laws, we will pardon them, and they, like us, shall honourably toil. The goods of the earth are for all. Those only shall suffer who refuse to work for the good of all. The happiness of the whole community must be our only aim and object. The tyrant has passed away, and it now becomes our duty to erect upon the ruins of tyranny the Republic of Man. It is a reminder of this, if you like, a sort of vein of, well, it's optimism, isn't it? It's optimism and hope. You could call it naivety or innocence, but it's optimism, which, we also need. We actually need optimism in order to get through.
Ultimately, what Workers' Tales does is provide a snapshot of one aspect of working class culture and politics in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. It gives us an idea of the far-reaching networks of publications and educational institutions set up largely by and for working class people. The stories in Michael's anthology take many of the frameworks in fairy and folk tales and turn them into powerful modes for putting forward radical ideas about how the world works and how it could be different. In doing so, they show that even the seemingly innocent field of children's writing is, like every area of life and culture, shot through with struggle.
Every area of culture contains within it contest, whether it's film, jazz, rock music, just name any form of culture, dance, any of it. There's contest. And what are the contests about? Some of it is about my rights as who I am, my identity. So a lot of art is about identity. So it's saying, do I have equal rights to express myself? Some things are about directly contesting the status quo in some form or another. So it might be the status quo in whatever social world is created in this work of art, whether it's a palace or whether it's, just think of Shakespeare, of a society of Macbeth or whatever. There's a society that's presented to us, and does the play or the whatever it is, does it affirm that? And then other forms of art contest things. You used the word signifier earlier, so we could say that all art is using forms of signification. That's to say words or the human body in dance or notes for music and so on. So sometimes art gets preoccupied with whether it can assault the signifier, whether it can subvert it. In other words, say, should that form of signification, the word or the music, stay the way it is? And of course, let's take music, people have created what we call modernist music, experimental music, that subverts the old things of the major minor scales, the octave, and all the rest of it. So they're subversive. There's contest there. Now, we can argue about which is more or less significant, and you can never tell. When Bob Dylan came along, some of his songs seemed to be very, very subversive, and then other songs seemed to be less so. And then some people said, oh, well, if he's got an electric guitar, it's less subversive. And other people said, rubbish, it's more subversive. So, we can always argue about that, but I would say that all art, no matter what kind, positions itself in relation to contest. Some art affirms everything that is good and fine about society. It affirms the ruling order. It might paint aristocrats or big bourgeois characters as if somehow or other they're right in everything. It could represent them that way, or it could cunningly present them with certain sort of aspects that undermine them. There's a famous tradition in Renaissance art of sticking skulls around in the pictures of royalty, and it's quite cunning. It's a little reminder that this very powerful monarch will die one day. It's just a little mild reminder with his skull sitting in the corner of a picture of some great ruler or monarch. So all art enters contest, whether it likes it or not, or even whether it intends it or not. So when it comes to children's literature, no exception. Why should it be? Some of it is very, very affirmatory of social order. You get sort of in 19th century and Edwardian stories, sort of silent servants who just appear with meals and disappear again. And so it's no question asked, or at least even less answered. And others that ask questions, and they may ask questions about identity, or they may ask questions about school being an important institution, or indeed family. And I would say that in the present context, there are a lot of writers who are interested in many range of ideas that do not accept the status quo. Famously, Mallory Blackman has written the Noughts and Crosses books, which took a very simple idea, take the Romeo and Juliet idea, take the social order, where largely white people are running things, and where black people are, where people of colour are, they're not in ruling places. And she switched it. So the ruling order are people of colour, and she's got a Romeo and Juliet story going of people across the colour bar, if you like, that's created in the books, in that world, fall in love. So this is all very interesting and immediately engages the attention of the reader with thinking, well, is that a mirror image of what's in society? Oh, wow. And so it invites all sorts of questions. So I just take that as one example. So we've been talking about socialist books. It's not a socialist book. And of course, Mallory wasn't trying to write that. She was trying to alert the attention of readers to how power and race intersect. That in its own way seems to me a very powerful thing to try to do with a book and with young readers. So there's a hell of a lot of stuff out there. I've had a go at writing a few myself. I wrote two kind of, what can I call them? Well, they're really meant to be stories, novels that deconstruct. We'd now call it decolonize. They're two decolonizing novels. One's called You're Thinking About Donuts, and the other one's called You're Thinking About Tomatoes. In Donuts, a little boy is awake in a museum. It's a kind of nightmare in a museum sort of thing. In fact, I wrote it before the film came out, Night in a Museum. But the boy comes awake and he then meets all the things in the museum and discovers where they all come from, basically. And he's threatened and then manages to get away. And then he goes to a stately home and does the same thing. And they're meant to be, if you like, that form of literature that sort of deconstructs reality through the means of fantasy. So, many of us are trying all sorts of different ways to do it. You could take a completely comic, silly set of books called Captain Underpants, and they subvert, if you like, school culture. There's a couple of boys who are kind of put upon, and they have a way of turning the head teacher into a baby in underpants. And so the whole of the kind of status quo of a school is undermined. And it's based on the writer, Dav Pilkey's own experience of being just written off as just this little kid who scribbled cartoons. And in a way, he's got his revenge through the book because the book's all about the power of cartooning. So people are trying all sorts of different ways. And of course, there's some books that are more, if you like, status quo-ish. But you could argue that at the heart of children's books, there's two contesting ideas. One of which says that children can be agents. So in a situation in which we look at society in terms of the distribution of power, then obviously children have virtually none. And in the modern era in schools, with what's called the knowledge-rich curriculum, there's a huge emphasis on children not having agency, but just the passive receptors of knowledge, that anything that insists that children can be agents and are agents is in its own way subversive. Now, against that, you have at the heart of an enormous amount of children's literature what's called prelapsarianism. That's to say the idea that the world is fallen since the time of Adam and Eve, that the world and adults are fallen, but contrasted with that, children are innocents. And so there's a sort of idea that frolicking around in children's books are children who are innocent. They're unaware of money, debt, capitalism, murder, war, sex. So they're unaware of all these things, and instead they're just playing. So these two, if you like, they're two poles that tug at children's literature. On the one hand, ain't it fun to be a child and playing? And on the other, hey, if children are agents, then they can see what's going on and respond to it. So I think children's literature is very interesting in that these two kind of poles, if you like, contest. You can find other poles as well, but I'm quite interested in the contest between those two.
That's the end of our double episode with Michael Rosen on socialist fairy and folk tales in Great Britain. We also have a bonus episode where Michael goes into more detail about the historical context for the stories included in Workers' Tales, as well as the history and ideas behind syndicalism, available now for patrons. So if you enjoyed the show and want access to the bonus content, as well as early access to episodes and discounts on books and merch, do consider joining us at patreon.com/workingclasshistory. And if you can't spare any money right now, that's no problem. You can still support us by sharing our content and giving us 5-star reviews on your favourite podcast app. The music for this episode was the Italian anti-fascist resistance song Bella Ciao, courtesy of Dischi del Sole. Links to stream and buy it in the show notes. I also want to say thanks to all the Working Class History patrons for making this sister podcast possible, and a special thank you to Connor Canazzi, Shay, James, Ariel Joya, Stone Lawson and Fernando Lopez Ojeda. We wouldn't be able to make these shows without the support that all of you give us. Anyway, that's it for today. Hope you enjoyed the episodes, and thanks for listening.
E se muoio da partigiano, oh bella ciao, bella ciao, bella ciao, ciao, ciao. E se muoio da partigiano,